Federal Drive is presented by GEHA, Government Employees Health Association, proudly providing health and dental benefits to federal employees and their families. Visit GEHA.com.
And now, the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton, sponsored by GEHA.
Welcome to the Federal Drive on Federal News Network. It's Monday, November 10th. I'm your host, Terry Gerton, and I'm glad you're here. Coming up on this hour of the Federal Drive, signs of movement in shutdown negotiations on the Hill. Plus, open season starts today, and feds are facing rising premiums and tough choices on coverage. Those stories and much more ahead during this hour of the Federal Drive. We begin with this. Federal employee unions are suing the Trump administration for including a new essay question on most job applications. One of the questions asks candidates how they plan to advance the Trump administration's priorities. Plaintiffs in the lawsuit say that amounts to a loyalty test for the nonpartisan civil service. Federal News Network's Jory Heckman is here with more details. Jory, thanks for coming by.
Hey, Terry. Great to be here.
What is the question at the center of this lawsuit?
Yeah, so it's one of several questions that have been introduced as part of the administration's new merit hiring plan. And this question asks candidates applying for federal jobs how they plan to advance the president's executive orders and policy priorities, and to name one or two specific executive orders or policy initiatives that are significant to the candidate and how they would implement those policies if they were hired.
What does the union object to specifically about that question?
Yeah, so this lawsuit is being led by three unions here: the American Federation of Government Employees, the American Federation of State, County, and Municipal Employees, and then the National Association of Government Employees. They all say that this question does amount to a loyalty question, and that these are responses that factor into who advances to the next round of the hiring process and who doesn't, and that this gives the Trump administration the opportunity to weed out people who are not aligned with its policy goals. The central focus of the lawsuit here is they say that this question violates candidates' free speech rights because candidates either have to align to a certain viewpoint, say basically the right things to advance to the next round of hiring, or to be chilled in their speech, knowing that if they say something that is perhaps counter to what the administration is looking for, that they would not get advanced to the next round of questioning. The other concern raised with the court here is that this violates the Privacy Act because it is collecting unnecessary and irrelevant information about an employee's viewpoints.
So what's the status of the case?
So this was introduced to the U.S. District Court for the District of Massachusetts. We'll see whether the judge, in a matter of probably in the next couple of days, week or so, whether there is some sort of injunctive relief, whether they step in and say this question can't be used or not. But this is a question that's been around since this spring, I believe since May, and so it has been used to great effect already, and it's something that many candidates have been encountering. And one thing that's been raised through this lawsuit is that this is something that is impacting employees who have already gotten a layoff notice and they're trying to find other work within the federal government. They point to the Education Department. They are one agency here where they, at this point, through layoffs and voluntary incentives, they've shed about half of their workers, and they are now filling many of the same positions that they just let people go from. They are now hiring for those same positions, rehiring, and they're now asking these questions. And so that is something that the union is flagging as well, basically saying that these are not jobs that the department says are no longer necessary, but they're asking for candidates who align to these loyalty questions.
That's really interesting. What has the administration said in response to the union's concerns and the litigation?
Right. So pretty soon after we saw the rollout of this merit hiring plan, we saw guidance from the Office of Personnel Management. They told agencies that this question is non-mandatory it's encouraged for agencies to put it out there. And so there's a scenario where candidates just leave the field blank. They don't fill it out, and they still can complete the job application. It's not like it's going to be a required field and you can't click submit. OPM says that the question shouldn't be used as a political litmus test and that the scores won't be ranked or scored in any kind of way. And the unions were quick to push back on that. They acknowledge that's what OPM is saying, but they do point to the fact that these are responses that will be reviewed by the people in charge of the hiring decisions, as well as political appointees in the Trump administration. And they say, of course, this question will play some role in the hiring process. Otherwise, why would they include it in the first place?
Sure, if you're an applicant and it says this is optional, and yet you really know that you're not going to be considered without completing it, you're going to try to drive on and figure out what the right answers are, right?
You'd think, yeah.
Well, and there was some talk at the beginning that this was a question that was perfectly designed to apply AI to, and then the administration came out and said, no, you can't use AI in your application process, right?
That is something that does appear on these job applications on USA Jobs, is that candidates are forbidden for using generative AI tools like ChatGPT to respond to these questions.
So what do you think happens next? While the case moves forward, the questions will persist.
Yeah, and they have persisted in a pretty significant way here. The numbers provided in this lawsuit, the plaintiff unions say that this question has appeared on about 5,800 federal job applications so far, and that a significant bulk of them, about 1,700 of them, have been posted since the start of the government shutdown. And this really does cover the waterfront in a pretty big way. It appears on everything for applications to be a meat cutting worker at the Defense Department, to a research biologist at the Agriculture Department, to a laundry worker at the Department of Veterans Affairs. And the unions, again, they say this question and the response to it, or non-response to it, has no bearing on whether candidates are qualified to do the work, do the job.
And those numbers are even while we're in a fairly broad federal hiring freeze. If the shutdown ends and hiring picks up again, I suppose that application will be even more expansive.
That's right. Yeah, we have been largely in a hiring freeze for much of this fiscal year and for much of this calendar year. And there, are some signs of that falling to some degree. There's this whole idea that for every 4 federal employees who leave government agencies are allowed to bring one new one in. But that there's some signs that some people are going to have to be coming in the door here to replace people who have left.
Well, Federal News Network's Jory Heckman. Jory, thanks for bringing us this story. It will be interesting to see how it plays out in the coming weeks.
It sure will. Thanks, Terry.
You can find his story at federalnewsnetwork.com. Still to come, the shutdown creates an employment law minefield for federal contractors. This is the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Welcome back to the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. As the shutdown stretches on, federal contractors face growing wage and hour risks, from delayed payments to potential violations of labor law. Employers trying to do the right thing may still stumble into legal trouble. Here to explain how contractors can protect themselves and what organizations should be doing to stay compliant is the co-chair of the Employment and Labor Practice at Morrison & Foerster, Andrew Turnbull. Mr. Turnbull, thanks for joining me.
Glad to be here, Terry.
Well, we're now in the midst of the longest lapse in appropriations in our government's history at the federal level. So we were tuned in to the impacts right away on federal workers and contractor workers. What are you seeing now that this has gone on for over a month?
It's really creating a lot of challenges for federal contractors and their employees. I think we've seen, unfortunately, over the last decade or so, a number of different government shutdowns. And so I think it's not surprising to either federal contractors or employees that there was going to be a shutdown potentially this time. I think what is surprising at this point is how long it's going on. And so this is really causing a lot of issues for contractors and their employees. Certainly from the contractor side of the house, some are experiencing stop work orders. They've already had those. They're getting delays in contracts awards and payments. And obviously this impacts their cash flows, their project timelines, how are they going to do the work that they're contracted to do, but it also has a lot of ripple effects for their employees. We are seeing a lot of cases where Certain contractors' employees have been permanently laid off. In a lot of other cases, they're just being furloughed. And some of them are being asked to use their PTO during this period of time to kind of cover their pay. But, this is continuing to go on. And so that PTO is running out, and that is, causing a lot of unique issues for contractors to have to navigate. And so there's a lot of business and legal issues for contractors to consider here. They need to think through various federal and state compliance issues like wage and hour issues, providing advance notice for layoffs. If they have unionized workforces, maybe there's going to be issues with having to comply with their collective bargaining agreements or potentially bargaining with their unions. And then from the business side of the house, there's a lot of practical issues in terms of trying to have good employee relations here. They want to certainly treat their employees the right way and also try to retain the talent. So, when the shutdown hopefully ends and they get the work back, they can have everybody back in the seat and retain the good people.
So talk us through some of those labor law issues that apply to the private sector that are different from how federal employees, furloughed federal employees or accepted service are affected.
One of the big issues that comes up here is wage and hour compliance, and that applies sometimes to federal employees as well, but also certainly to private contractors. And there's a federal and state overlay that can sometimes have conflicting rules on certain things. A lot of contractors have had to furlough employees so they don't have work for them at a certain point in time. And if you're talking about non-exempt employees who are eligible for overtime and are hourly workers, it's generally, from a wage and hour perspective, pretty easy for compliance because if they're not working, you don't have to pay them. Now, that could not be the case, particularly if you have a collective bargaining agreement. There may be issues where you have to bargain with the union or comply with that. But it becomes much more complex where you have exempt employees who you pay a salary to and you don't have to pay overtime to. Exempt employees per federal and state law have to receive their full salary for any week in which they perform any work. Now, this is regardless of the number of days or hours that they work in a week. And you can't deduct from their salary for like partial day absences. So, essentially what contractors have to do is make sure that they don't perform any work during a work week during a furlough, or they could be on the hook to pay their entire salary. And if you fail to comply with this, you potentially could lose the exempt status for that employee. And in some circumstances, you may lose that for all employees who are in the same position. So it's a big issue to comply with. And this creates a lot of practical challenges because we all know during shutdowns, there's a lot of ongoing work where things kind of ramp up, may shut down, or maybe it's periodic. And so how do you comply with this? How do you tell people, hey, you can't work at all, or you can only work these amounts, and making sure that you have the funds to pay for these things? And in some cases, the government's not going to pay you for all the idle time that they're doing. And so it creates practical challenges from a compliance and also a business perspective. Another issue that can come up too is, some contractors will, unfortunately, due to being cash strapped, they may have to ask certain employees to take salary reductions. And they can do that under federal law. State laws may differ on some of this, but they have to be very careful in terms of how they do these salary reductions. Obviously, there's an employee relations issue to that, but from a wage and hour perspective, they can't reduce it below a certain minimum salary threshold, or they could void that exempt status. And they also can't kind of fluctuate their salary back and forth, because if they do that, then they're considered more like hourly employees, and they may also lose the exempt status. PTO can also create some interesting issues as well. Most companies who have PTO policies, they have to make a business decision. Do we want to force our employees to use their accrued PTO during this period of time? That's not an easy question for all companies. Employees, sometimes view that very negatively. But from a compliance perspective, most of the time, employers can have a right to force their employees to use their PTO, subject to certain exceptions. So certain state laws may have certain rules around when you can have employees use their PTO. For example, PTO may include paid sick leave. And some states have mandatory paid sick leave threshold, and it could violate paid sick leave laws to mandate that an employee have to take a paid sick leave for something like a furlough, which is not a covered reason for that sick leave.
I'm speaking with Andrew Turnbull. He's the co-chair of the Employment and Labor Practice at Morriston and Forster. It sounds like from a corporate HR perspective, this is a really tricky time. And on top of that, the federal wage and hour office is mostly furloughed. So there's less oversight and really not anybody to call if you have questions. How are companies navigating in this time frame?
Yeah, I think, at this point, right, I think a lot of companies are having to make sure that they look at their compliance, right? There's a lot of areas that you can misstep on. And even though maybe some of these federal regulators right now are not looking at these claims, certainly the plaintiff's bar is, and employees know how to contact, attorneys and enforce their rights. And in some cases, these attorneys are not going to go through federal enforcement agencies. They're going to go straight to court, particularly for wage and hour issues. Another issue that can come up here is the Federal WARN Act, and states have a lot of mini WARN laws, and that creates a lot of issues. So these WARN laws typically require contractors to have to provide advance notice if they are going to lay off, and in some cases furlough employees for a certain period of time. Under the federal WARN, if there is a mass layoff or a plant closing, you have to provide 60 days advance notice. Now, you could, in some instances, pay in lieu of, but that's a bigger chunk of money if the company can't provide that advance notice. Now, the good news is under federal WARN, they do have an exemption for furloughs. So if it's not an actual employment loss, you do and plan as the employer to call back these individuals to work. There is a 6-month period of time where you could furlough someone without triggering WARN. We hope that this shutdown does not go past 6 months. So for most federal contractors, you may not trigger federal WARN, but not all states follow that same exception for their mini state WARN laws. For example, California famously does not follow that. So if you have, furloughed employees for a certain period of time and you trigger that law from a WARN perspective, you may still have to comply with it. So it creates a very nuanced kind of patchwork of laws that you have to kind of think through in this area. And that's just one example of the many things that companies, or contractors have to continue to navigate.
It sounds like there's a lot of uncertainty and a lot of variability in how these wage and hour laws apply to companies depending on where they are, how long their folks might be off the job, and when they might alert them to come back. Are there best practices that you suggest for companies as they're trying to communicate with their employees about what's happening?
Yes, I think, it is hard for a lot of contractors to have a lot of time. In these types of situations, you may receive a stop work order and have to immediately stop work and make decisions on that. But I think this is where trying to get as much advanced planning as possible is very key here. There is a lot of issues to consider and plan for, as we've talked about, wage and hour issues, WARN issues. And a lot of times when you have contractors, there's a lot of stakeholders that you have to consider internally, both from a management, executive capacity. You may have, other types of subcontractors and other entities that you may need to consider what to do with. So there's a lot of decisions to be made. And so planning as early as possible is very key here. And working closely with your internal or external counsel to understand, kind of what are the landmines that you need to navigate here. As you mentioned, communication is key. And that goes for multiple levels. One of those is making sure you communicate with your customer, the government customer. What are the expectations here from the government customer? Is it completely stopping work? Is it, stop and start? What are their expectations? They may not know all of these things, but certainly trying to have good communication with them to understand what are they being pressured to do at this point in terms of their funding. What do they expect? And that will hopefully give you some insight to plan a little bit better. Also understand, in past government shutdowns, some contractors were not reimbursed for days their employees were idle. I don't know if agencies are going to have clarity on that here, but maybe talking with your contracting officers to understand, is that going to be the case going forward? They may not have received any direction on that yet, but certainly something to cover with your contracting officer. Also, making sure you communicate with obviously impacted employees. Retention and employee morale is key here. It's a difficult time for everyone, and I think, having some sensitivity with your employees, making sure that your communications are clear, consistent, transparent. Obviously, you may not know all the details of everything, but try to be as transparent as possible. Make sure they understand the rules of the road that you've set in place, and make sure that managers understand those things as well. We talked about earlier the wage and hour compliance issue, and if you have employees who are exempt employees who are furloughed in a week and you don't want them to perform any work during that work week, so you don't have to actually pay their full salary, you want to make sure that you have communications in place to inform employees, do not perform any work. You may even want to think about taking a step further and saying, we're just going to cut your system access during this period of time so you can't actually work. You might want to hop on an email and we don't want to have to pay you for that. So these are all things that, you have to kind of think through as a best practice when you're thinking through these things. I think the other thing is, there's a lot of things that can come into play here from the contractual and legal perspective. Sometimes we will find that In the haste of doing things, people may forget, oh, yeah, so this employee actually has a employment agreement that requires severance. Maybe it's for good reason if you diminish their duties at all. And so a furlough may trigger that. So, making sure that you kind of know where all the different traps could be can take time to kind of pull these things together. So checking all those boxes. And then this is obviously a fluid situation. Be prepared to monitor and adjust and ramp back up and ramp down as need be.
I've been speaking with Andrew Turnbull. He's co-chair of the Employment and Labor Practice at Morrison & Foerster. Thank you so much for helping us understand the complexities of this really difficult time.
Sure. Happy to do it, Terry.
We'll post this interview at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Subscribe to the Federal Drive wherever you get your podcasts. Still to come, signs of movement in shutdown negotiations on the Hill. But first, open season starts today, and feds are facing rising premiums and tough choices on coverage. You're listening to the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Welcome back to the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Open season kicks off today. Federal employees and retirees are facing another round of double-digit premium hikes, shifting plan defaults, and new coverage options. Here to explain what's changing and how to avoid paying for coverage you don't need is John Hatton from NARF. John, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
Open season kicks off today. People might have been a little distracted by all the other things that are happening in the federal government and with the federal workforce. But if they wake up this morning and they're listening to us and they go, oh my goodness, it's open season, what should they know initially about timelines and important things to look at?
Well, they have from today until December 8th to make a choice of plans. And we highly encourage people to look at their plan options every single year. But really this year, it's even more critical with the second year of double-digit premium increases. So you really have an opportunity to save money by choosing a different plan in many cases. There's a lot of good plan options with quality comprehensive coverage. And so it's really just about making sure you're able to walk through a process that makes you feel confident in that change of plans and choice. And so, we're there to always help people with that decision-making process, but really encourage people to go through it.
If people are furloughed and they're not seeing their office emails, they don't have access to their work computer, does that pose a challenge for anybody getting ready to enroll?
People should still be able to enroll through the normal portals. I think where it poses a challenge with the shutdown ongoing is just communication from federal agencies. So OPM is still up and running. They have funds paid essentially through your premiums for administration of the program. But the agencies are shut down and you may not have health fairs going on. You may not have communications from agencies. You may be lost in terms of where to go to enroll and sign in. And so that part I think will be challenging for people, but accessing, being able to actually make a change and accessing OPM hopefully should not be.
So they're going to have to do a little bit more of their own research at that point. Talk to us or point us in the right direction about what's new and what people should really be paying attention to in this year.
Well, plan options remain pretty broad and comprehensive, and there are tweaks from year to year. I think on the program-wide basis, there are some additional required coverages like PrEP medications for HIV treatment. The administration took away gender-affirming care treatments. There's, continues to be IVF coverage or for infertility treatment in the program. So each plan has to cover at least one GLP-1 medication. So there are some tweaks around, I would say, the edges of the program in terms of program-wide. But I think people really need to take a look at their individual plan. And each plan may change. And I think we've seen a little bit more changes plan to plan than we typically see or that we've seen in the past. I know on the postal side, there's some tweaks to Medicare reimbursements, which is really a lot of retirees find critical. So if you already have Medicare, you can get some money off those premiums in certain plans. There's been some tweaks on the postal side, but not the federal side for that. So I think it's really important for people to look at that section 2 of the plan brochure and take a look at the individual changes, because not only are you facing these increases in premiums, you may have changes in your underlying plan.
So let's talk about those premium changes. This is a second year of double-digit premium hikes. What's driving the cost increases?
I wish I could give you a very specific answer. OPM provided some very generic answers like cost of providers have gone up. Some increased utilization of prescription drugs, including GLP-1s, is probably the most specific thing they provided. But, the costs of healthcare are going up across the country, and that's reflected in these premiums.
Healthcare premium costs are a big issue in the shutdown conversation and negotiation. Is that related to the prices folks are seeing for the federal programs?
Mostly no. The issue over the ACA premiums is whether to extend enhanced subsidies. So this is on the Affordable Care Act exchanges for people who don't have employer-based coverage, don't have Medicare, don't have Medicaid. And during COVID, one of the bills that passed enhanced those subsidies. So it used to be up to a certain amount. There are now stronger subsidies. So if those go away, people are seeing potentially triple-digit increases in their premiums in terms of percentage, and from just large amounts of money that are going to really make it hard for people to retain their healthcare coverage at all. And they don't have, I don't think, the same ability to choose a new plan that saves them more money the same way you may in response to the FEHB premium increases. There is still underlying increases in those premiums, though. So I think maybe 26% on the Affordable Care Act exchanges if you take away the subsidies. So that is related. There's an underlying premium increase that's across the board that's affecting both FEHB and the Affordable Care Act. But the issue with the shutdown is these enhanced subsidies that allow people that don't have employer-sponsored coverage to get affordable health care. And that's kind of been the crux of the Affordable Care Act in the first place. It's providing some safety net and alternative outside of your employer-based coverage. And luckily, federal employees and retirees have that employer-based coverage and it's quality, but some people in this country don't.
I'm speaking with John Hatton. He's staff vice president of the National Association of Active and Retired Federal Employees. John, let's come back to the OPM plans. They made some changes to default plans for folks whose coverage is going away. What do people need to know if they're looking at an automatic enrollment? How is that process going to play out? And what if it doesn't fit their needs?
Yeah, anytime your plan is dropping out, you're defaulted into a different plan. So you don't totally lose coverage. You don't have to make an affirmative choice. That's a good positive thing. This year, the NALC plan is dropping out of the federal side of the program. They're still in the postal side. So if you're a postal employee or retiree, you can still retain it. But that's a significant number of people. OPM made the choice to not default into the lowest cost nationwide plan without a high deductible and without an association membership fee. That's what the regulation says. Then it has another sentence that says they reserve the right to designate an alternate plan for automatic enrollments. So this year, the lowest cost nationwide plan would be the GEHA Elevate plan, but instead they have designated the GEHA High plan. So in the past, you would be automatically enrolled into a low premium plan. In this case, you're automatically enrolled into a high premium plan. So particularly if you had, the consumer option in NALC, for example, you're going to see a huge spike in increases if you just defaulted in and you don't make an affirmative choice. So we really encourage people to choose. I mean, maybe the high premium plan with more coverage is the right choice for you, but you may want to look at some other alternative plan, even with those low deductibles, that might be cheaper, because there are options even with really low deductible plans that have lower premiums than kind of the main big dogs in the program. So really critical that you look and choose what's best for you.
So back to our point at the beginning, which is people really need to do some research, especially if they don't have access to the experts in their organization.
Yeah. And NARF provides resources. We have webinars that walk people through their options and really step-by-step, how do you simplify the process? We actually surveyed members, and first of all, about less than 5% of people change plans every year, unfortunately. And I think that's because they also said about 80% or more are content with their plan, but people are not content with these huge double-digit premium increases. But the reason they often, I think, don't change is because the complexity of the process, and they've said they'd rather write a will or read Shakespeare in terms of understanding the process. So we really try to simplify it step by step so you can feel confident that if you're making a choice that lowers your premiums, you're still retaining some quality coverage. And I think that's what people are most worried about. They have a plan that works for them. They don't like the premiums are going up, but for them to switch, they're taking a risk and a leap of faith that this other plan is going to do and meet their needs the same way. And I think when people realize that they could be leaving potentially thousands of dollars on the table, like that's the difference in premiums. It's For a self-only plan, for similar low deductible plans, it's $200 a month. For self and family, it's $500 a month. If you're switching to a high deductible plan, it's even more. So you could have $7,500 in premiums difference in some cases from one plan to another. And yes, you're risking a higher deductible, but it's maybe, $1,500 more or something like that. So you're going to save, $6,000 just on premiums and have to maybe pay a little more out of pocket after the fact. But so just thinking about some of those things and what the trade-offs really are with some of these choices. It's a lot to navigate. It's complicated. People don't understand the terms all the time. They don't understand the trade-offs, and they want to make sure they can get healthcare when they need it. But it really is, the plan is designed to utilize the fact that you have a choice in plans to create competition to help drive down costs. And when people aren't actually making a choice, it's not really working that way. So I think we've seen these double-digit increases in part because people aren't making those choices.
I've been speaking with John Hatton. He's Staff Vice President of the National Association of Active and Retired Federal Employees. John, thanks for the roadmap through the forest of open season.
Yeah.
We'll post this interview at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Hear the Federal Drive on demand. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Still to come, signs of movement in shutdown negotiations on the Hill. This is the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Welcome back to the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Last week's hopes for progress in resolving the partial government shutdown seem to have hit a stop sign over the weekend. Regardless of the impacts on air travel, SNAP benefits, and military pay, Senate Democrats are holding firm on their demands, and Republicans are equally resolute in their positions. The House, meanwhile, remains in recess. Here with more details on the shutdown negotiations is Maeve Sheehy, congressional reporter with Bloomberg Government. Maeve, thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
Well, let's talk about the current state of shutdown negotiations in the Senate. You're sitting up there. What are you hearing?
Yeah, we are officially well into the longest shutdown ever. There's some growing frustration on both sides as we see kind of travel delays, people missing their SNAP benefits. So a lot of problems are starting to pile up, but we're still seeing each side be pretty dug into its respective point of view. There are bipartisan conversations right now going on in the Senate. I just spoke with House Appropriations Chairman Tom Cole, and he was speaking a little bit about the negotiations that are happening with a continuing resolution and a minibus. But really what we see happening here is a lot of going around in circles. They keep landing on the same issues that we've had since the very beginning, like with Affordable Care Act tax credits. So it's kind of a question mark right now where we'll be able to get out of this, but it does seem like there's intense pressure on both sides to reach an agreement.
Well, there was some optimism at the beginning of last week that faded by the end of the week. There was perhaps hope that they could move that minibus with the three agreed upon appropriations bills, Milcon VA, USDA, and Ledge Branch. What's going to happen there?
Yeah, we saw a lot of confidence, especially on Monday with that three-bill minibus. After Tuesday's elections, Democrats did better than a lot of people were expecting, and that kind of, you could say, inspired them to dig in a little bit more. They see that as that the American people are kind of on their side with this. And so things have derailed a little bit, although I will say for the first 35 days of the shutdown, there were barely any bipartisan negotiations in the House or Senate. And now we're actually seeing senators sit in rooms together and talk about a way out. So that is kind of a step forward to ending the shutdown, even though there isn't any sort of agreement yet.
Well, certainly in other pressure points, the FAA's reduction of domestic air travel, the reduction in SNAP benefits, and coming up on another military pay cycle, all of those were expected to be pressure points. Are you seeing that anybody is feeling the need to respond to those?
Yeah, and especially with the flight delays, you hear a lot about this because in the 2018-2019 shutdown, that was kind of a big forcing mechanism for lawmakers to make a deal. And we actually did see the FAA have to cut hundreds of flights already at airports across the country. So what you're going to see is people having delayed flights, people having canceled flights, and that's obviously a pretty big disruption. Lawmakers are taking note of that. It's making things much more urgent, especially with the holidays coming up, being the busiest travel time of the year. With SNAP benefits, I would say that there's been a lot of discussion about this, but there's that kind of legal fight going on between the Trump administration and judges over how many benefits and whether they can immediately put out full benefits. So there's been a lot of questions around that, but there definitely is a lot of stress from the perspective of the 42 million Americans who received these food stamps and didn't get them at the beginning of the month.
Right. And I guess the other point that we had expected to maybe move hearts and minds was the healthcare premiums increase. I mean, the feds are now in open season. Other folks are looking at the ACA premium benefits. That doesn't seem to be having the effect people expected either.
Yeah, Democrats for a long time had said that November 1st was a huge day in this whole experience because that's the day that people would begin open enrollment, see that their premiums were going up. And while that did happen to a degree, it's not really having any sort of shutdown ending effect. We're hearing Senate Democrats really calling for an ACA subsidy extension, and Senate Majority Leader John Thune has said that he would put that on the floor for an up or down vote. But the big problem here, or the big hangup, is that Speaker Mike Johnson in the House won't promise to put that on the House floor for a vote. So getting a bill through the Senate is all well and good, but it doesn't really have any impact unless you can guarantee that it will also go through the House. And that's why we're seeing these negotiations repeatedly come up against this same obstacle.
Well, you mentioned that folks are at least meeting in the same room to have some conversations. Do you have a sense of what the non-negotiables are from each side?
It seems to me that, well, from the House perspective, I'll start with that because I'm a House reporter. Speaker Johnson does not want to negotiate at all because he believes that the House has done its job and that Democrats are kind of holding the government ransom. In the Senate, it seems like Democrats are intent on having some sort of health care takeaway. They also want to make sure that federal workers who have been furloughed over the past month will get their back pay. That is guaranteed under law, under 2019 law. And until the shutdown, it's been pretty understood that federal workers who are furloughed will get back pay. But there's been some questioning about the legality of that, and the Trump administration has suggested that perhaps they won't get the back pay, which would be a really big deal, obviously, for a lot of federal workers.
I'm speaking with Maeve Sheehy. She's a congressional reporter with Bloomberg Government. Well, Maeve, to that exact point about back pay for federal workers, Ron Johnson has a bill to pay accepted federal workers and military service members during the shutdown. Is that getting traction?
It's one of those things that sounds like it would, but actually hasn't. Basically, most Democrats have said it's gotten some bipartisan votes, but that they don't want to kind of accept very narrow parts of the workforce and allow them to get paid because that could leave vulnerable other people not to get paid. Because Ron Johnson's bill would pay some federal workers, but not every single federal worker. And I think that that's kind of the big sticking point, and that's what's stopping it from getting more traction than it has.
That's an interesting take on it. Well, let's change topics just a little bit. What else is going on with the legislative agenda? We know that the NDAA might be moving to conference soon. What else are you hearing?
Yeah, in the House, there's really not much happening at all because they've been out of session for almost 50 days at this point. It's been a really, really long time, and there haven't been committee meetings. There haven't been sort of the bipartisan meetings that there usually would be. So that's obviously hampering things over here. In the Senate, they've been able to do a little bit more. And also, as you mentioned earlier, there are discussions about appropriations. So even if Congress does pass a clean continuing resolution to keep the government funded or to fund the government again, there are still those appropriations bills that are really important in the eyes of lawmakers to get done.
So really, until we get the shutdown sorted, not a whole lot else happening in those back rooms on the Hill.
Yeah, we've been hearing a lot less about pretty much every single policy area ever since the government shutdown happened, just because it's become the number one issue.
Well, there was one other tidbit of information last week. Nancy Pelosi announced she's not going to run for re-election. How did that play out?
Yeah, it wasn't necessarily a surprising decision because Pelosi had sort of hinted that maybe this would be her last term. She's been on the Hill for so long. This is her, I believe, 21st or 20th term in office. So she's one of the longest serving members. I think the real question that this raises for me, and that I've heard on the Hill as well, is will some of these other longest serving members, like Congressman Steny Hoyer, who served in leadership with Pelosi, like, will they also kind of take this as their time to leave? And the Democratic Party has had this whole question of generational change, of passing the torch, ever since President Biden stepped down. You know, there were all of these questions about committee leaders in the House. So it's really interesting to look at who is in leadership positions in the House and how long some of them have been there.
Yep, that generational change question continues to come up. So we'll see whether she's opened the door for others.
That's the big question.
I've been speaking with Maeve Sheehy. She's a congressional reporter with Bloomberg Government. Maeve, thanks so much for being with us today.
Thank you for having me.
We'll post this interview at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Subscribe to the Federal Drive wherever you get your podcasts. Federal employees are experiencing disruptions in the workplace at a rate nearly 3 times the national average. Close to 1/3 of federal employees say their workplace has been disrupted to a very large extent this year, according to new data from Gallup. For more on the latest findings, Federal News Network's Drew Friedman spoke with a Gallup director and senior consultant, Camille Lloyd.
We do quarterly research that tracks U.S. employees across the board. But what I thought that was particularly interesting in the data is not necessarily just one particular data point, but to how volatile. We've been looking at just 2025, the fluctuations that we see from quarter to quarter on key core items that we know are important to employee engagement. Just that movement in the data and how much of an impact the changes and the speed of changes that are occurring within the U.S. government is impacting federal employees, right? So you typically kind of see that lagging effect to be like, well, how will this show up in the way that I work? What we are seeing based on some of the changes from quarter to quarter over the last 3 quarters, it signals that some of these changes are having immediate impact that we are picking up in our surveying. I think when you look at these data in the context of probably when changes are happening or what is happening in the workplace and the workforce in general, we can contextualize the numbers that we're looking at based on those conditions. For instance, when we saw some of those numbers in quarter one around, worry, stress, and anger and sadness, they weren't as high. But then when we see in quarter two, in our tracking and picking it up, we do see an uptick in those numbers among federal employees. And so I would say just contextualizing what we know was happening around that time, that those emotions don't seem counterintuitive for those to go up.
And then also I was really interested in the findings on satisfaction and engagement. With the engagement piece specifically, can you talk about some of the trends you see there? And also, is there a specific way that Gallup defines what engagement is?
So we have a measure of engagement we call the Q12. And these are 12 actionable questions that really measure how well an organization is meeting the needs of employees. And those needs are related to, am I focused, right? Do I have job clarity? What do I get? Are those the basic needs? Do I have clarity in the work that I'm doing? Do I have the materials and equipment I have to do that job well? Also, kind of like, am I supported to provide in terms of my individual contribution? So it's the, what do I give, right? So it's like, know me, help me to see my value, care about me, and help me to grow, right? So that's that kind of individual contribution element of what our organization is supposed to be providing employees in order for them to be engaged. And then we have questions around teamwork. And that is what you would say, do I belong? And so those questions look at whether or not my opinions count, whether or not the work you're doing is important. So we have a question around mission. The mission and purpose of my job makes me feel my job is important. We have questions around that associate. So that teamwork, my fellow associates are committed to doing quality work. And, ways for building trust. And how we measure that is, I have a best friend at work. And then the last element, if you think about it as a hierarchy of what needs employees have, is that element around growth. Do I have an opportunity to grow, right? So what does that look like? It looks like review. Do I get feedback and information around my progress, as well as do I have opportunities to learn and grow? So we call that the Gallup Q12. So there are 12 really simple questions that we all need in terms of that need we all have as employees, regardless of where we work, what we do, And so using the Gallup Q12, we're able to look at your responses to those 12 elements and determine whether you are engaged, not engaged, or actively disengaged. And that's based on your ability to answer each of those questions on a scale of 1 to 5. So that's pretty much how we measure the engagement at Gallup using our Q12. To your question around the trends. So what we are seeing, and this is global, like engagement is down. And we've been tracking engagement for over 4 decades. And so what we are seeing kind of like globally and also specifically nationally is there's a downward trend in engagement in terms of the overall percent of workers who are engaged at work. And that there's no difference when we look at the federal workforce, right? So we do see that engagement is also going down in the federal workforce. But I would not say that that is unique. We see that across nationally in terms of our trending.
And what about in terms of satisfaction levels? Can you talk about the trends that you've been seeing most recently there?
So when we look at the most recent quarter 3 numbers for overall satisfaction, we see that it's just 17% of federal workers strongly agree that they are satisfied, right? Their overall job satisfaction. That number, I would say, is very similar to what we see for the U.S. workforce overall. It's 18%. So less than 1 in 5 federal employees are satisfied. What we've looked at compared to last year, where we left off in 2024, that was about 22%. So there is a decline now we're seeing in quarter 3 at 17% and where we left off in 2024. So we're about on track to say that overall job satisfaction is lower for federal employees compared to 2024. Just the rate of fluctuations that we are seeing, we are seeing that responding to those fluctuations, the data is much more impacted when we are seeing changes that are happening. And that's not surprising because we see that almost a third of federal employees are saying that their workforce over the last year, they've had large disruptions.
Looking more ahead and what potentially agencies or federal managers can do with this data, do you have any recommendations of, where you can go from here as the federal workforce, as federal employees? What comes next?
For federal leaders and managers to really kind of acknowledge that there is, I would say, an important and also unique thing happening within the federal workforce, where we are seeing that federal workers are more likely to say that they, that their organization have changed in a way that has been very disruptive to a large extent for them. And what we know from our research at Gallup is that there are certain things that we know that will that tends to happen to employees when they're going through these disruptive times. So there's going to be confusion around clarity. And that's also something that we know, as I mentioned earlier, clarity is important when we think about engagement. Focus me. So understanding that employees are probably in a state of flux where they really don't understand or are clear on what their managers expect of them. So not to assume that there's clarity around job, but and also purpose, right? So when you start to think about what we've seen over the years in our tracking, our federal workforce on that Q12 question that I mentioned earlier around the mission or purpose of my organization makes me feel my work is important. Our federal employees numbers on that particular item is usually higher than our national average. And as an industry, we always see strong positive scores on that particular area. When we lack clarity, we know that those are the areas that tend to be impacted. So what does that look like when we're going through this time where employees feel like that there's disruption? Is to hone in on that. How are we communicating and continuing to connect employees to that mission and purpose of the work that they're doing? I think that's the second piece that I would say. So really doubling down on resetting on clarity, also figuring out ways to continue to communicate and connect what employees are doing to the mission and purpose of the organization. And then the third thing that I would like to say, because this is also what we see in our research around times of change or when people feel like the way they do things are being disruptive, is a lot of that support comes from managers. And what I would say to leaders is double down on making sure you're supporting managers in ways that will help them feel confident and supported in being able to be there for their teams. Because what we know is that when there's disruption in manager support and managers don't feel supported in disruptive time, it significantly impacts team morale, which we know 70% of engagement is impacted by the manager. So we can explain the variability in whether a team is engaged or not engaged through the manager and the work of the manager. So really focusing on supporting managers and letting managers feel confident to respond to what changes are happening within their workforce.
Camille Lloyd is a senior consultant and director at Gallup. She's speaking there with Federal News Network's Drew Friedman. You can find Drew's exclusive story at federalnewsnetwork.com. The Federal Drive with Terry Gerton is produced by Eric White and Michelle Standiford. Our web editors are Daisy Thornton and Stephanie Wright. For the latest updates, stay with federalnewsnetwork.com or follow us on Facebook, YouTube, and LinkedIn. I'm Terry Gerton. Thanks for listening.
Phil McNamara, former Assistant Secretary for Administration at the Department of Transportation, emphasizes that in government, relationships matter more than titles. On this episode of Lessons in Leadership, McNamara shares how he's led large teams, navigated the future of work, and built trust across agencies. In conversation with Shane Canfield, CEO of WEPA, he offers practical insights on leading with humility, empathy, and clear communication in today's complex federal landscape.
Hello, and welcome to the Lessons in Leadership podcast. I'm your host, Shane Canfield, CEO of WEPA. Today, I'm joined by Phil McNamara, former Assistant Secretary for Administration at the Department of Transportation, and also former Assistant Secretary for Intergovernmental Affairs at the Department of Homeland Security. Welcome, Phil, and thank you for joining me.
Thank you so much, Shane.
You've spent time leading in multiple agencies, including both DHS, DOT. What's something you learned early in your leadership career that carried you over into future positions?
Before I dive in, let me just, for any federal employees listening to this podcast or recent former federal employees, I want to say, I see you, I value you, I thank you for your service on behalf of the American people. I wish things weren't happening the way they are happening now, but just a thank you. So you're right, Shane. I've been fortunate to serve in government twice now. If there's one thing that really kind of speaks to leadership philosophy, it's to listen first. I think back to onboarding at Homeland Security in 2009, right? I was coming from politics. I was in my mid-30s at that point. I learned you have to listen first. There's always pressure to immediately sort of make your mark. But, I think if you take the time to listen to people, whether that's career staff, whether it's, external stakeholders, build the trust, you will then be set up for sort of longer term success. And, whether it's, responding to, a crisis or just responding to, an employee concern or trying to drive, some sort of, initiative, employees, they want to be seen, they want to be heard, they want to be respected. So I think that it's that foundational lesson.
In your time in government, you've also held multiple different roles where you were managing personnel, as you've been talking, but personnel and HR policies.
Yeah.
And how did those kinds of people-driven positions affect your leadership style?
I think, if anything, the people-driven positions has made me a better communicator. There's just so much information to process that I had to be able to express what was going on to employees and leadership in a succinct and, explanatory way. And, obviously, during my time at DOT, right, the administration passed the largest infrastructure, bill in a generation, right? And big part of that at DOT was getting that money out the door, right, quickly. But it also meant that, DOT had to, hire thousands of new employees, right? Here I was, right? I had to learn about all these hiring authorities that we could figure out a way to expedite hiring and meet the demands of what the administration wanted us to get accomplished. And, I couldn't go to Secretary Pete, right, and start talking to him about the intricacies of Title V or OPM regulations for delegated hiring authorities and everything that was entailed there in the same way that I could talk to my HR directors about that, right? So I had to find a way to, get the information to where it needed to be in the form that was most useful to the audience, right? It's sort of like, what is your audience, right? And I think that really helped me cut through what was necessary and what was sort of, fluff.
Absolutely, I agree with that completely. And was there a time when you had to make a difficult decision as a federal leader? And if you could unpack that a little bit, how did you work through that challenge?
Looking back, I think one of the hardest things we dealt with was in 2021 as we were sort of, we were all remote. We still had thousands of air traffic controllers that had to report on site. But for the most part, DOT we were doing this remotely. And so, how were we going to bring employees back to the office in a safe way? It really challenged me to think sort of more holistically, realize there's not one answer. It made me be more flexible. We had thousands of employees who now had been, working remotely for 18 months. How were we going to bring them back? And I really relied on my team to be my sounding board to help craft the best approach possible. Where I sat, right, I had the competing demands of balancing the employee concerns with the administration's priority, right? So I think it was very challenging. Employees and people are an agency, a company, an organization's most valuable asset, right? And so, I was deeply, deeply committed to ensuring that we did this in a way that was sort of very employee-centered. That, I think, was one of the hardest challenges we solved. And, fast forward now to, 2025 with the Trump administration and just, a full-fledged 5 days a week back in the office. I don't know if anyone's really figured out the magic sauce on this, whether it's the federal government or the private sector. Everyone's still grappling with that.
Yeah. If you were to go back to the start of your career, what's one piece of advice that you would give yourself now?
The first that's really easy is just to take a long view, right? Which is that, you can get so wrapped up in whatever you're dealing with in the here and now in that day, and then just kind of take a step back and say, will any of that really matter in 5 months or 5 years? And if if it matters in 5 years, okay, yeah, invest the time and the emotional energy into it. And I think the other thing that just I would tell myself, and a constant reminder is, people will say, oh, will you meet with this, young person who's just graduating college and looking for a job, or will you meet with this intern who's down in DC for the summer? And I always say yes. No matter how busy my calendar is, I will always say yes. And what I always tell interns and folks starting out, early in their career here in DC is relationships matter more than titles. Early on, right, you're running this rat race, and you're trying to climb the ladder and get to that next rung, and chase the next cool job title. But I think what truly propels someone's career is the network of people, the colleagues, the mentors, the collaborators you build along the way, and the people you work with, right, today may become your partners down the road. So, relationships matter. Invest in those relationships. You have to show up with respect, shared values, mutual trust. But I'd say invest in relationships is just the constant reminder.
Who is one person, it can be somebody you know personally or somebody well-known, who has impacted your leadership style?
You're not going to get me to pick my favorite. But, one thing I will say I took away from my most recent boss, Secretary Pete, was just a reminder why we're doing the work we're doing, right? In particular, I think in the federal government, and it's so easy, right, to talk in either jargon, acronyms, and so I mentioned earlier the infrastructure law, and so for instance, there's a brand new grant program in the infrastructure law called the Bridge Investment Program, and it was, I think, $15 billion over 5 years to essentially repair, rehabilitate poor or at risk of being poor, failing bridges across the country. In the federal government, we can talk about it as the Bridge Investment Program and $15 billion, right? And what Secretary Pete always challenged us to do is talk about that in ways that average Americans would understand, right? And so what average Americans understand is if they have a bridge in their community and that bridge is frequently having detours or lanes of the bridge have to be sort of taken out of service and that causes delays, well, we can talk about the investment we're making and we're going to repair that bridge and it's going to be more safe and it's going to reduce delays or detours and it's going to save you time on your commute. That's far different than talking about a $15 billion bridge investment program, right? Anytime he would always challenge us just to constantly make the work we're doing matter to the American people. And so that's something that I take with me.
Well, this has been absolutely wonderful, Phil. Thank you so much for your time. And thanks to everybody for tuning in. This is Shane Canfield, CEO of WEPA, reminding you to empower your team and embrace challenges. Until next time on Lessons in Leadership.
Find the full podcast and future episodes of Lessons in Leadership on the Federal News Network app and anywhere you enjoy your podcasts.